Karen, with her perfectly coiffed hair and meticulously ironed floral dresses, was the self-proclaimed queen of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Her life revolved around maintaining order, and order, in her mind, meant strict adherence to every single HOA rule, no matter how small. She knew the bylaws like the back of her hand and considered it her civic duty to point out any infraction, big or small. Her most prized possession was her designated parking spot, number 7B. It was strategically located close to the entrance of her building, and she took immense pride in keeping it pristine. God forbid a rogue grocery cart or, worse, a misplaced vehicle dared to encroach upon her sacred space. To Karen, a parking violation wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a personal affront, a sign of societal decay. She viewed herself as a warrior against chaos, a guardian of the HOA's sacred parking covenants. Little did she know, her unwavering dedication to the rules was about to be tested in the most unexpected and dramatic way possible. An event that would make her reconsider everything, and bring her community crashing down upon her. The seeds of her regret were about to be sown. All because an ambulance would park in her spot, and she would call 911. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek as Mrs. Davison, Karen's next-door neighbor, began to feel a sharp pain in her chest. It started as a dull ache but quickly escalated into a crushing sensation that made it difficult to breathe. Mrs. Davison, a sweet elderly woman who always had a kind word and a freshly baked cookie for everyone, clutched her chest and stumbled towards her phone. With trembling hands, she dialed 911. Her voice was weak and raspy as she described her symptoms to the dispatcher. I think I'm having a heart attack," she gasped, her words barely audible. The dispatcher, recognizing the urgency in her voice, assured her that help was on the way and instructed her to unlock the door and lie down. Meanwhile, Karen was meticulously watering her petunias, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding next door. She hummed a cheerful tune, carefully pruning any stray leaves that dared to disrupt the perfect symmetry of her floral arrangement. Her world was small and orderly, and she intended to keep it that way. The impending chaos was about to shatter her carefully constructed reality. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The ambulance, lights flashing, sped into the Willow Creek complex, its arrival shattering the peaceful afternoon. Paramedics, trained to act swiftly and decisively, assessed the situation. Mrs. Davison's apartment was closest to parking spot 7B. Without hesitation, the driver pulled into Karen's spot. Every second counted. They grabbed their equipment and rushed towards Mrs. Davison's apartment, their minds focused solely on saving her life. Protocol dictated speed and efficiency, parking etiquette was the furthest thing from their minds. The rumble of the engine and the flashing lights drew the attention of several residents, who emerged from their apartments to see what was happening. A small crowd began to gather, their faces etched with concern. Nobody questioned the ambulance's parking location, everyone understood the gravity of the situation. Except, of course, for one person. Karen, still tending to her petunias, heard the commotion and peered over her balcony. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the scene below. The ambulance, its bulky form occupying her precious 7B, was an unwelcome sight. A frown deepened on her face. This was simply unacceptable. Karen, fuming, marched out of her apartment and towards the gathering crowd. Her floral dress billowed behind her as she navigated the small group of concerned neighbors. "Excuse me. Excuse me," she exclaimed, her voice sharp and demanding. The neighbors, focused on the paramedics rushing in and out of Mrs. Davison's apartment, barely noticed her approach. Reaching the ambulance, Karen planted herself firmly in front of the open back doors, effectively blocking the paramedics' path. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice dripping with indignation. "This is my parking spot. You can't just park here." One of the paramedics, his face pale and drawn with worry, paused and looked at Karen with exasperation. "Ma'am, we have a medical emergency. We need to get through. This is not the time to discuss parking." "I don't care about your emergency. Karen retorted, her voice rising in pitch. This is a clear violation of HOA Rule 3.2, subsection B. Unauthorized vehicles are not permitted to park in designated spots. I pay my dues. I deserve my parking spot. The other paramedic emerged from the apartment, carrying a medical bag. He stared at Karen in disbelief. Lady, a woman is having a heart attack. Get out of the way. But Karen stood her ground, her arms crossed, her face a mask of righteous fury. The seeds of her regret were about to sprout. Fueled by a sense of entitlement and unwavering belief in the righteousness of her cause, Karen pulled out her phone. I've had enough of this, she declared, her voice trembling with indignation. I'm calling 911. This is an illegal parking situation, and I demand that it be rectified immediately. The paramedics exchanged horrified glances. Ma'am, are you serious? One of them asked, his voice laced with disbelief. We're trying to save someone's life here. You're calling 911 about a parking spot? That is correct. Karen snapped, her fingers stabbing at the phone screen. I am reporting an illegally parked vehicle. It is obstructing my designated parking space, and I expect immediate action. She pressed the call button, holding the phone to her ear with a triumphant smirk. The small crowd of neighbors watched in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of shock and disgust. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others muttered under their breath, questioning Karen's sanity. Even the most ardent supporters of HOA rules were appalled by her callous disregard for human life. The seeds of Karen's instant regret were now fully planted, watered by her own self-righteousness, and about to bloom into a full-blown crisis. Little did she know the 911 call she was about to make would change her life forever. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone. Karen, puffed up with self-importance, launched into her complaint. Yes, I'm calling to report an illegally parked vehicle. It's an ambulance, and it's parked in my designated parking spot, number 7B, at Willow Creek Apartments. I demand that it be ticketed and towed immediately. The dispatcher, a seasoned professional who had dealt with countless emergencies, paused, momentarily taken aback. Ma'am, are you certain this is an emergency? An ambulance is usually present due to a medical situation. I don't care why it's here. Karen insisted, her voice growing shriller. It's illegally parked. I pay my HOA fees. I deserve to have my parking spot free and clear. This is absolutely an emergency. What if I needed to park there? Where would I park? The dispatcher sighed inwardly. She could hear the commotion in the background and suspected there was more to the story than Karen was letting on. Ma'am, is anyone in danger? Yes. I'm in danger of not having my parking spot. Karen exclaimed, completely missing the point. The dispatcher realized she was dealing with someone completely detached from reality. The regret Karen would feel was close, so very close. The dispatcher, trying to maintain her composure, attempted to reason with Karen. Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but it sounds like there's a medical emergency in your building. The ambulance is likely there to help someone who is sick or injured. Parking regulations are secondary to saving a life. That's not my problem. Karen retorted, her voice laced with impatience. My problem is that my parking spot is being occupied illegally. I'm sure they could have parked somewhere else. There's plenty of street parking a block away. The dispatcher sighed again, realizing she was dealing with an extraordinary level of self-absorption. Ma'am, paramedics need to park as close as possible to the patient to provide immediate care. Every second counts in a medical emergency. Well, they should have thought about that before parking in my spot. Karen huffed. Maybe they should have called ahead and asked for permission. Honestly, the audacity of some people. The dispatcher, now thoroughly exasperated, decided to change tactics. Ma'am, I'm going to mark this as a non-emergency parking complaint. However, I strongly advise you to consider the possibility that someone's life may depend on that ambulance being there. Is there anything else I can help you with? The seeds of regret were almost ready to burst. No, that will be all, Karen said curtly, and slammed the phone shut. She stood there, arms crossed, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She had reported the infraction, and she fully expected the authorities to arrive and rectify the situation. Meanwhile, inside Mrs. Davison's apartment, the paramedics were working feverishly. They had hooked her up to an EKG machine and were administering oxygen. Her breathing was shallow and erratic, and her skin was clammy. Every beep of the heart monitor was a stark reminder of the preciousness of life and the urgency of the situation. The paramedics knew they had to get her to the hospital as quickly as possible. One of them radioed for backup, requesting assistance with the transport. Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity. Outside, the neighbors continued to watch, their faces etched with worry. The contrast between the life-or-death situation inside the apartment and Karen's petty obsession with her parking spot was jarring, highlighting the depths of her self-centeredness. The seeds of her impending regret were ready to bloom into full, agonizing awareness. Mrs. Davison lay on her living room floor, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes fluttered closed, then snapped open, filled with fear. The pain in her chest was excruciating, a heavy weight crushing her. The paramedics worked swiftly and efficiently, their movements practiced and precise. One paramedic carefully inserted an IV line, while the other monitored her vital signs. Blood pressure dropping, he announced grimly. Heart rate elevated. We need to move, now. They gently but firmly transferred Mrs. Davison onto a stretcher, carefully securing her with straps. Her frail body seemed even smaller and more vulnerable as they wheeled her towards the door. Every bump and jolt of the stretcher sent a fresh wave of pain through her. As they navigated the narrow hallway, Mrs. Davison's eyes met the worried gazes of her neighbors. She managed a weak smile, a silent thank you for their concern. The paramedics knew that every second counted, that their speed and expertise were the only things standing between Mrs. Davison and a potentially fatal outcome. The urgency of the moment was palpable, a stark contrast to the triviality of Karen's parking dispute. The seed of regret was about to sprout. As the paramedics wheeled Mrs. Davison out of the apartment, the neighbors turned their attention to Karen, their faces a mixture of anger and disappointment. Karen, how could you? Mrs. Rodriguez, a kind woman who lived across the hall from Mrs. Davison, exclaimed, her voice shaking with emotion. A woman's life is at stake, and you're worried about a parking spot? It's not just about the parking spot. Karen retorted defensively, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. It's about principle. It's about following the rules. Rules? Mr. Johnson, a retired veteran, scoffed. This isn't about rules, Karen. This is about common decency. Mrs. Davison is a wonderful woman, and she needs our help, not your petty complaints. But the HOA. Karen stammered, her voice trailing off. She could feel the weight of their disapproval, the collective judgment of the community pressing down on her. The seeds of her regret were starting to send roots deep into her conscience. The HOA can wait, Karen, another neighbor chimed in. Mrs. Davison can't. Get a grip and show some compassion. Several neighbors started to murmur their agreement. The isolation Karen would soon feel was starting to take hold. Just as the ambulance doors slammed shut and the vehicle began to pull away, a police car arrived, its lights flashing, adding to the chaotic scene. Two officers emerged from the vehicle, their expressions serious. They had been dispatched to investigate a report of an illegally parked vehicle. Officer Miller, a young officer fresh out of the academy, approached Karen, who was still standing defiantly in front of the remaining neighbors. Ma'am, we received a call about a parking violation. Can you explain what's going on? Karen, seeing a chance to vindicate herself, puffed out her chest. Yes, officer. That ambulance was parked in my designated parking spot. I called to report it. Officer Miller glanced at the departing ambulance, then back at Karen, his brow furrowed. "Ma'am, do you realize there was a medical emergency? That ambulance was there to help someone." "I don't care." Karen snapped, her voice rising again. "Rules are rules. They can't just park wherever they want." Officer Davis, a seasoned veteran with years of experience, stepped forward, his gaze firm. He had already spoken briefly with some of the neighbors and had quickly pieced together the situation. "Ma'am, I think you need to understand the gravity of the situation. Obstructing emergency services is a serious offense." The seed was growing fast. Officer Davis's words hung in the air, a stark warning that began to penetrate Karen's self-absorbed bubble. "Ma'am," he continued, his voice firm but measured, "obstructing or delaying emergency medical personnel can have serious consequences, both for the patient and for you. Depending on the circumstances, you could face charges ranging from a misdemeanor to a felony. Do you understand?" Karen's face paled slightly. The smugness that had characterized her demeanor began to crumble, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. But I didn't know it was that serious," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Whether you knew it or not, ma'am, your actions could have had dire consequences," Officer Miller added, his tone equally serious. "Mrs. Davison is on her way to the hospital now, and every minute counts. Your focus should be on hoping she's okay, not on a parking spot." Officer Davis pulled out his notepad. "I'm going to need your name and address, ma'am. We'll be filing a report, and the district attorney will decide whether or not to pursue charges. In the meantime, I strongly suggest you reflect on your actions today." The seed had fully bloomed. The flower of regret was about to blossom. As Officer Davis wrote down her information, Karen's mind raced. The officer's words echoed in her ears: obstructing emergency services, serious offense, potential charges. The reality of the situation began to sink in, slowly but surely. She looked around at the faces of her neighbors, their expressions a mixture of disappointment and anger. The weight of their judgment was almost unbearable. She had always prided herself on being a law-abiding citizen, a pillar of the community. Now, she was being treated like a criminal. I didn't mean to cause any harm," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. I just wanted them to follow the rules." Mr. Johnson, the retired veteran, shook his head sadly. "There are times when rules need to be set aside, Karen. This was one of those times. You need to learn to prioritize compassion over compliance." Karen remained silent, her gaze fixed on the ground. A wave of shame washed over her, but still, a small part of her clung to her initial justification. But what if I had needed that parking spot?" she whispered, almost to herself. The flower of regret was blooming, but the thorns of defensiveness still pricked. The following morning, a sense of unease hung over Willow Creek. The neighbors exchanged worried glances, wondering about Mrs. Davison's condition. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Later that day, Mrs. Rodriguez emerged from her apartment, a relieved smile on her face. She gathered the neighbors and announced, "I just spoke with Mrs. Davison's daughter. She's stable and recovering in the hospital. The doctors said she got there just in time. They were able to clear the blockage and prevent any permanent damage." A collective sigh of relief swept through the group. The neighbors rejoiced, grateful for the positive news. Mrs. Rodriguez continued, "The doctors also emphasized how crucial the ambulance's quick response was. Every minute mattered, and they credit the paramedics with saving her life." Her words hung heavy in the air, a direct and pointed indictment of Karen's actions. The neighbors turned to look at Karen, who was standing on her balcony, her face pale and drawn. The full weight of her actions crashed down on her. She had almost contributed to a tragedy, all because of a parking spot. The flower of regret was now in full bloom, its beauty overshadowed by the thorns of shame. The repercussions of Karen's actions were swift and severe. The HOA, after a hastily called emergency meeting, slapped her with a hefty fine for conduct unbecoming of a resident and disrupting community peace. The fine, while significant, was the least of her worries. The social consequences were far more devastating. Neighbors who had once greeted her with smiles and friendly waves now averted their gaze, their faces etched with disapproval. Invitations to neighborhood gatherings suddenly stopped arriving. The book club she had cherished for years unceremoniously removed her from the roster. Even her most ardent supporters within the HOA distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with her actions. She became an outcast, a pariah in the community she had once ruled. The once vibrant Willow Creek now felt like a cold and desolate place. Adding insult to injury, the local newspaper picked up the story, branding her HOA Karen calls 911 on ambulance. The article went viral, turning her into a figure of ridicule and scorn. The flower of regret, now fully bloomed, was a constant reminder of her monumental error in judgment. The thorns of isolation dug deep. Desperate to salvage what remained of her reputation, Karen decided to issue an apology. She drafted a carefully worded statement, focusing more on explaining her perspective than expressing genuine remorse. She printed copies and slipped them under the doors of her neighbors. The apology read, "To my valued neighbors, I understand that my actions regarding the ambulance parking situation may have been misconstrued. I was simply trying to uphold the HOA rules, which are in place for the benefit of all residents. While I regret that Mrs. Davison experienced a medical emergency, I believe it's important to maintain order and follow established procedures. I hope you can understand my position." The apology was a disaster. The neighbors saw right through her thinly veiled attempt to justify her actions. It lacked sincerity and failed to acknowledge the potential harm she had caused. Many crumpled up the apology and tossed it in the trash, further solidifying their negative opinion of her. Mrs. Rodriguez, upon reading the apology, shook her head in disbelief. "She still doesn't get it," she muttered. "It's all about her, even now." The flower of regret wilted slightly under the harsh light of her insincerity. The thorns of isolation tightened their grip. The path to redemption would be long and arduous. The label, HOA Karen, stuck to her like glue. It followed her everywhere, a constant reminder of her misdeeds. Even months after the incident, the neighbors still whispered about her behind her back, their eyes filled with judgment and disdain. New residents moving into Willow Creek were quickly filled in on the story, warned to avoid "that woman" who called 911 on an ambulance. Her reputation was tarnished beyond repair, a cautionary tale whispered from neighbor to neighbor. The HOA, once her domain, became a source of constant embarrassment. She dreaded attending meetings, knowing that she would be met with cold stares and pointed remarks. Her influence, once considerable, had vanished entirely. Even simple errands became agonizing ordeals. A trip to the grocery store or the post office was fraught with anxiety, knowing that she might encounter someone who recognized her and would subject her to their scorn. The flower of regret, now fully withered, offered no comfort. The thorns of isolation had become her constant companions. She was alone, trapped in a prison of her own making. The road to redemption looked impossibly long. Alone in her meticulously clean apartment, Karen sat by the window, staring out at the now unfamiliar landscape of Willow Creek. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows across the manicured lawns, mirroring the distorted reality she had created for herself. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional chirping of crickets, a sound that once brought her peace but now served as a constant reminder of her isolation. She replayed the events of that fateful day in her mind, each detail magnified and distorted by the lens of regret. She saw again the ambulance, its lights flashing, the paramedics rushing to save Mrs. Davison's life. She heard again her own voice, shrill and demanding, prioritizing a parking spot over human compassion. She felt again the weight of her neighbors' disapproval, the sting of their judgment. For the first time, she truly understood the magnitude of her mistake. It wasn't just about breaking HOA rules, it was about breaking the unspoken rules of human decency, of empathy, of compassion. The flower of regret, though withered, still carried a potent scent of sorrow. She finally understood the depth of her error. She began to see a glimmer of light in the darkness. Perhaps, just perhaps, redemption was possible. In the wake of Mrs. Davison's heart attack and Karen's subsequent actions, the community of Willow Creek began to heal and rebuild. Neighbors, realizing the importance of unity and compassion, started to organize. Mrs. Rodriguez spearheaded a fundraising effort to help Mrs. Davison with her medical expenses. They set up a GoFundMe page and organized a bake sale, raising a significant amount of money in a short period. Mr. Johnson, the retired veteran, organized a neighborhood watch program to ensure the safety and well-being of all residents, especially the elderly and those living alone. He also started a community garden, encouraging neighbors to come together and cultivate a shared space. The book club, once Karen's sanctuary, decided to dedicate their next meeting to discussing themes of empathy and forgiveness. They even sent a get-well card to Mrs. Davison, signed by all the members. The atmosphere in Willow Creek began to shift, replacing the tension and animosity with a sense of camaraderie and support. The neighbors had learned a valuable lesson, that community is more important than compliance, and that compassion trumps rules. The seed of hope, planted in the aftermath of Karen's actions, began to sprout, promising a brighter future for Willow Creek. The flower of unity was about to blossom. The incident with Mrs. Davison and Karen sparked a much-needed conversation about the HOA rules and their potential for unintended consequences. Several residents, emboldened by the community's newfound spirit, began to question the rigidity and inflexibility of certain regulations. A series of town hall meetings were organized to discuss potential reforms. Residents shared their concerns about the strict parking enforcement, the overly restrictive landscaping guidelines, and the lack of exceptions for emergency situations. The HOA board, now under intense scrutiny, agreed to review the existing bylaws and consider amendments. They formed a committee to research best practices and draft proposals for rule changes. One of the key proposals was to create a compassionate exception clause, allowing for temporary waivers of certain rules in cases of medical emergencies or other extenuating circumstances. Another proposal focused on revising the parking enforcement policy to prioritize the safety and well-being of residents. The discussions were often heated and passionate, but they were also productive and ultimately led to positive changes. The HOA, once a symbol of rigid control, began to evolve into a more responsive and compassionate organization. The flower of unity blossomed, spreading its petals to encompass even the most inflexible aspects of community governance. Despite the community's efforts to heal and rebuild, Karen remained on the periphery, a ghost in her own home. The neighbors, while forgiving and supportive of each other, found it difficult to extend the same grace to her. Her attempts to participate in community events were met with polite but firm rejections. She tried to join the community garden, offering to donate her expertise in floral arrangement, but was gently told that her services weren't needed. She offered to volunteer at the bake sale, but was informed that all the positions were filled. The whispers continued, the stares lingered, and the isolation deepened. She felt like she was living in a bubble, separated from the rest of the world by an invisible wall of judgment. The flower of regret, now a skeletal remnant of its former self, offered no solace. The thorns of ostracism had pierced her soul, leaving her wounded and alone. The community, in its efforts to move forward, had inadvertently left her behind, a casualty of her own making. The path to redemption seemed to grow longer and more arduous with each passing day. The glimmer of hope she had glimpsed in her moment of reflection seemed to fade with the setting sun. Driven by a desperate need to be understood, Karen occasionally attempted to explain her actions to those who would listen, or at least, those who couldn't easily escape. She cornered the mail carrier, rambling about the importance of following rules and the unfairness of the situation. The mail carrier, after a few polite nods, quickly excused himself, claiming an urgent delivery. She tried to engage the grocery store clerk in a conversation, explaining that she had simply been upholding her civic duty as an HOA member. The clerk, after a forced smile, called for the next customer, effectively ending the discussion. Even her therapist, a kind and patient woman, struggled to break through Karen's wall of defensiveness. Karen would spend her sessions justifying her actions, focusing on the technicalities of the HOA rules rather than acknowledging the emotional impact of her behavior. Each failed attempt only deepened her isolation and reinforced the community's perception of her as someone incapable of empathy or remorse. The flower of regret, now reduced to a scattering of dried petals, offered no comfort. The thorns of misunderstanding continued to prick, reminding her that words alone were not enough to bridge the chasm she had created. Her actions spoke louder than any explanation she could offer. Karen's rigid adherence to rules and her need for control didn't emerge in a vacuum. They were rooted in a childhood marked by instability and uncertainty. Her parents, well-meaning but often preoccupied with their own struggles, provided little structure or routine. As a child, Karen craved order and predictability. She found solace in meticulously organizing her toys, arranging them in perfect rows and becoming distressed if anything was out of place. Rules, to her, were not constraints but anchors, providing a sense of security and control in a chaotic world. Her family moved frequently, disrupting her friendships and forcing her to adapt to new environments. Each move reinforced her need for order, as it was the only constant in her ever-changing life. She clung to rules and routines as a way to cope with the anxiety and uncertainty of her circumstances. This need for control manifested itself in various ways throughout her life, eventually leading her to the HOA, where she found a sense of purpose in enforcing the rules and maintaining order. However, this need, born out of insecurity and anxiety, had ultimately blinded her to the needs and feelings of others, leading to the disastrous events at Willow Creek. Understanding her past didn't excuse her behavior, but it offered a glimpse into the origins of her rigid worldview. A few weeks later, Mrs. Davison returned to Willow Creek, her health significantly improved. She was greeted by a cheering crowd of neighbors, eager to welcome her back. Tears welled up in her eyes as she expressed her gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you all," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "The paramedics, the doctors, and all of you, my wonderful neighbors, you saved my life. I am so grateful for your kindness and support." She made a special point of thanking the paramedics who had responded to her call, praising their professionalism and quick thinking. She also acknowledged the community's fundraising efforts, expressing her heartfelt appreciation for their generosity. Her words served as a powerful reminder of the importance of community and compassion, further highlighting the contrast between her selfless gratitude and Karen's self-centered actions. Even Karen, watching from her window, could feel the warmth and sincerity of Mrs. Davison's words, a stark reminder of what she had lost and what she could potentially regain. The smallest tendril of hope began to uncurl within her. Perhaps, kindness could bloom again, even in her hardened heart. Watching Mrs. Davison embrace her neighbors, Karen finally experienced a profound shift in perspective. It wasn't just an intellectual understanding of her mistake, it was a visceral, emotional realization of the harm she had caused. She saw, with painful clarity, that her obsession with rules and order had blinded her to the humanity of others. She recognized that her actions had not only caused Mrs. Davison unnecessary stress but had also damaged the fabric of her community. The carefully constructed walls she had built around herself began to crumble, revealing the vulnerability and loneliness she had been desperately trying to conceal. Tears streamed down her face, not tears of self-pity, but tears of genuine remorse. She understood now that true community wasn't about enforcing rules but about extending compassion, that true order wasn't about control but about connection. The small tendril of hope that had begun to uncurl within her now blossomed into a full-blown determination to make amends. The journey would be long and difficult, but for the first time, Karen felt a sense of purpose beyond the confines of the HOA. The flower of regret finally yielded the seeds of genuine change. Karen knew that regaining the community's trust wouldn't be easy. It would require more than just words, it would demand consistent, selfless actions that demonstrated a genuine change of heart. She started small. She noticed that Mrs. Rodriguez's trash cans were often difficult to maneuver to the curb, so she began taking them out for her, without seeking recognition or praise. She quietly started tending to the community garden, weeding and watering the plants, ensuring that the shared space thrived. She even anonymously donated a significant sum to Mrs. Davison's medical fund, hoping to alleviate some of the financial burden she had inadvertently contributed to. She knew that her past actions had created a deep chasm between herself and her neighbors, but she was determined to bridge that gap, one small act of kindness at a time. She understood that redemption was a journey, not a destination, and that it would require patience, humility, and unwavering commitment. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Karen felt a sense of hope and purpose. The seeds of change were planted, and now it was time to nurture them with kindness and compassion. The possibility of a new beginning glimmered on the horizon. One particularly sweltering afternoon, Karen noticed Mr. Peterson, an elderly gentleman who lived down the hall, struggling to carry a heavy box of groceries into his apartment. Without hesitation, Karen rushed to his aid, offering to carry the box for him. Mr. Peterson, initially hesitant, gratefully accepted her offer. As they walked towards his apartment, he struck up a conversation, completely unaware of Karen's past transgressions. He simply saw a kind neighbor offering a helping hand. Karen carried the box into his apartment, carefully placing it on the kitchen counter. Mr. Peterson thanked her profusely, offering her a glass of lemonade. Karen politely declined, explaining that she had other errands to run. As she walked back to her apartment, Karen felt a sense of satisfaction she hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't about seeking praise or recognition, it was about doing something genuinely kind and helpful, simply because it was the right thing to do. The act, though small, felt significant, a step towards rebuilding her shattered reputation and rediscovering her own humanity. A tiny bud of hope, fragile but persistent, pushed through the hardened soil of regret. Word of Karen's small acts of kindness began to spread slowly throughout Willow Creek. Mrs. Rodriguez, noticing that her trash cans were consistently taken to the curb, suspected Karen was responsible and offered a tentative smile when they crossed paths. Other neighbors noticed Karen tending to the community garden, diligently weeding and watering the plants, her brow furrowed in concentration. They saw her not as the HOA Karen of the past, but as someone genuinely trying to make a positive contribution. The whispers didn't stop entirely, but they began to shift in tone, from judgment to curiosity, and even a hint of hope. Some neighbors started to acknowledge her with a nod or a brief greeting, a small but significant step towards reconciliation. Mr. Peterson, completely unaware of Karen's past, raved about her kindness to anyone who would listen, further softening the community's perception of her. The ice that had formed around Karen's reputation began to thaw, revealing a glimmer of warmth beneath. The seeds of change were beginning to sprout, promising a potential harvest of forgiveness and acceptance. The journey was far from over, but the direction had shifted, towards a brighter, more hopeful future. Karen's commitment to being a better neighbor wasn't a fleeting effort, it became a consistent part of her daily life. She continued to take out Mrs. Rodriguez's trash cans, rain or shine, never seeking praise or acknowledgement. She diligently maintained the community garden, ensuring that it remained a vibrant and welcoming space for all. She started volunteering at a local soup kitchen, serving meals to the homeless and offering a listening ear to those in need. She also joined a support group for people struggling with anxiety and control issues, seeking to understand and address the root causes of her past behavior. She even started attending HOA meetings again, but this time, she listened more than she spoke, offering thoughtful suggestions and prioritizing the needs of the community over strict adherence to the rules. Her transformation was gradual but undeniable, a testament to her genuine remorse and unwavering commitment to change. The small bud of hope that had emerged began to blossom, its delicate petals unfurling to reveal a newfound sense of purpose and connection. The path to redemption, though still challenging, felt less arduous, illuminated by the light of her consistent efforts. Over time, the community of Willow Creek began to soften its stance towards Karen. The transformation wasn't sudden or dramatic, but a slow and steady process of acceptance, fueled by her consistent acts of kindness and her genuine remorse. Neighbors started to engage her in conversations, asking about her well-being and expressing appreciation for her efforts in the community garden. The HOA, recognizing her changed attitude, invited her to join a committee to revise the parking enforcement policies. The book club, after much deliberation, extended an invitation for her to rejoin, emphasizing their commitment to forgiveness and second chances. Even Mrs. Davison, upon learning of Karen's contributions to the community and her anonymous donation to her medical fund, reached out to her, offering a heartfelt expression of forgiveness. The label, HOA Karen, began to fade, replaced by a more nuanced and compassionate understanding of her as a flawed but ultimately well-intentioned individual. The walls of isolation that had surrounded her began to crumble, replaced by tentative connections and a sense of belonging. The long and arduous journey towards redemption was finally bearing fruit, a testament to the power of genuine remorse and unwavering commitment to change. The seeds of acceptance had taken root, promising a future where Karen could once again be a valued member of the Willow Creek community. Karen's journey was far from over, but she had finally arrived at a new beginning. She integrated herself into the community, not as the rigid enforcer of rules, but as a compassionate and understanding neighbor. She learned to prioritize empathy over compliance, to see the world through the eyes of others, and to recognize the humanity in every individual. She actively sought out opportunities to connect with her neighbors, offering support and assistance whenever she could. She even became an advocate for HOA reform, using her past experiences to champion policies that promoted compassion and flexibility. She worked tirelessly to ensure that the HOA served as a force for good in the community, rather than a source of conflict and division. Karen's transformation was a testament to the power of forgiveness and the resilience of the human spirit. She had stumbled and fallen, but she had also risen, stronger and wiser, embracing a new life defined by empathy, understanding, and a deep appreciation for the bonds of community. The HOA Karen was gone, replaced by a woman who had finally learned the true meaning of being a good neighbor. The story of her regret became a source of inspiration, a reminder that even the most rigid hearts can be softened by compassion and that redemption is always possible.